People of the universe, I'm Matt Micucci and this is Matt's Art Chat, my weekly series of podcast conversations about the arts with creators, curators and art lovers from all over the world. People of the universe, welcome to a brand new episode of my Matt's Art Chat series. This is a series of podcast conversations about the arts with creators, curators and art lovers from all over the world. I am Matt Micucci and I'm hoping that y'all listening to this are safe and sound and finding ways to take the time to make artistic discoveries of all kinds. The main topic of this week's podcast is tapestry art. It's not the most talked about of art forms in the world, but I guess that's part of the reason why I find it so exciting. And of course, people have found ways to be quite creative with it, including Archie Brennan, who took this ancient art form into the 20th century. Archie Brennan is also the main subject of a major exhibition opening at Edinburgh's Dovecote Studios next year, and we will be speaking about it with its co-curator, Kate GRENYER. It's also worth mentioning that this exhibition, titled Archie Brennan Tapestry Goes Pop, was co-curated with National Museum Scotland, and that it's set to run at Dovecote from the 26th of March next year. Hoping that by next year, of course, coronavirus and this global pandemic will be a thing of the past. Fingers crossed, everybody. But in the meantime, if you are ready to enter the world of tapestry art and find out more about Archie Brennan, let's begin. Hi Kate, how are you?
Hi Matt, I'm very good, thank you.
It's a pleasure for me to talk with you. We're going to be talking about an interesting exhibition that's going to be running at Dovecote Studios in Edinburgh. But before we do, what I like to do with these conversations is I like to find out a little bit about who I am speaking with, who I have the pleasure of speaking with. And, I'd just like to kind of ask you, and feel free to answer in whatever way you'd like. How did you discover an interest and passion for the arts?
For the arts generally, I think I've had that since I was very young, a child drawing. I never stopped drawing. And at school, the art room was my salvation, I suppose, the place I'd head to when I could, at any opportunity, even outside of school lessons. So going to study art was something I really wanted to do straight after school. And actually, I did study art practice. I was a painting student way back. But really, I developed a love after art school for working with other artists and organising their exhibitions and helping turn that into an interpreted exhibition for the public. So being that conduit between an artist studio and the public seeing their work for the first time really is what led me personally into curating. And so that's where I sit now, really, sort of 20 years later.
And how would you define the role of a curator?
As I said, I always think of it as you're kind of there to be, depending on whether you're working with an artist who's alive or working with a art from a collection, or you're not working directly with an artist, you're there to be a sort of conduit between the art that is created by that artist and the people who come to see it. And you're there to help that communication flow, because art is communication in its way, and you've got to try and be sympathetic to what the artist is about and what they want and need and what they are trying to do, and also try and open that up a bit and give it space to do its thing, but maybe put things together in a way that provides new connections or new ideas and gives the audience a chance to see things in a particular way.
And can you tell me a little bit about your journey that led you to actually working as an art curator? I know from speaking with different art curators that everyone seems to have had a personal journey that led them to it. What was yours like?
Yeah, mine was definitely from working with other artists when I myself was still had a practice, I suppose. And I just found myself more satisfied by the process of exhibition making than the process of sitting in the studio or wherever and making my own work. And in the end, that's also sort of led me round in a fairly roundabout way to be working at Dovecote, which is as a tapestry studio, and therefore has that particular leaning towards tapestry and textile as an art practice. So that's a particular interest that I'd always had floating around. I was never trained in tapestry or textile. As I said, I was a painter originally, but textile was always an interest. And then being able to work at Dovecote, I really feel I've kind of become, I wouldn't ever call myself an expert, but I feel like I've kind of got under the skin of tapestry in quite an interesting way over the past 8 years that I've been working here.
And we will, of course, be talking a lot about tapestry art in our conversation today. But before we do, well, you introduced Dovecote Studios, and I'd like to know a little more about it. And you also, I guess, said a little bit about its identity. But could you tell us a little bit more, maybe about its history and sort of mission statement, if you will?
Yes, sure. So Dovecote's an absolutely fascinating and genuinely, I think, a unique place. We were founded in 1912, so off the back end of the arts and crafts movement and the influence of William Morris, and were founded by a wealthy Scottish family, the Bute family. And the Marquis of Bute wanted tapestries. He was a real enthusiast for sort of medieval revival architecture. He built Castlecock in South Wales, and he built his incredible house Mount Stuart on the Isle of Bute, and he wanted medieval style tapestries for that. And rather than go down to Morris and Company and buy tapestries from Morris and Company, who were still making tapestries at that point, he poached a couple of artist weavers from their studio and invited them to come up to Scotland and start a studio up here. So that's how Dovecote was founded, on the sort of ethos of the way William Morris wanted tapestries to be made. But really throughout the 20th century, Dovecote has evolved and come to understand or create tapestry that was very much synonymous with the particular time periods in the art world as it evolved throughout the 20th century. So it created modernist tapestries with artists like Robert Motherwell, and then the artist we're going to talk about, Archie Brennan, was really influential in modernising the studio still further and really experimenting with tapestry and making it a very, very creative medium. And now we still continue to follow those joint ethos of working with, in the lines of traditional craft through the sort of Morris and Company route, but really also creating modern, contemporary, influential tapestries with artists who have an affinity or have an interest in what we're doing. So the most recent well-known project that we did was the Chrysophylle tapestry that was part of the exhibition he did at the National Gallery in London 3 years ago now. So yeah, big range of work.
So promoting art history as well as contemporary art.
Yeah, well, it definitely works. Our studio works in a contemporary way, always with contemporary artists or modern artists, but we definitely have our roots in a history, I suppose.
So Dovecote was born, you mentioned, at the start of the 20th century. And
yes.
I like this podcast series of mine to sort of also be a way for people to find out more about art history, speaking of art history. So you mentioned that it was born around the time of the arts and craft movement. What does that mean?
It's very much it's quite an English-led movement, really, come off the back of the work of William Morris and the Pre-Raphaelites, but really it was the idea that traditional crafts were dying in the face of industrialization and the Victorian era, and it was a movement that brought handcrafted objects into the world of art again and saw them as art, even if they were a handcrafted chair or a handcrafted tapestry, embroidery or whatever. They saw that as part of art. The art practice should not be separate from hand making, and obviously as a particular building style as well. Arts and crafts buildings particularly well known, but yes, it was quite pretty influential on a small period of culture in the sort of beginning of the 20th century, before Art Nouveau and Art Deco probably took over as interior design styles, and the world of art leapt into surrealism and Bauhaus and that direction. So it's a particular moment in time where both come together. probably between sort of late 1800s to about 1910, I suppose.
So, talking about the contemporary times, as seen as we are talking about Dovecote Studios, obviously these have been difficult times for art institutions, art galleries, art studios. How have you guys been responding to the pandemic?
Well, it's quite interesting. We are a tapestry studio, so we have a making side of what we do, and that side has been relatively unscathed, strangely enough, because we continue to get people interested in commissioning tapestry, which is fantastic, and we're always keen to have that support. And because tapestry takes a long time to make, we actually have quite a lot of orders, people who are interested in tapestry. So we've been able to carry on making whilst, we had to shut for a bit during what was quite a heavy lockdown when we first, back in March in the UK. But the minute the world of sort of manufacturing was allowed back, we could get back to the looms. We've had to adapt a little bit to what we do, because the weavers often work very closely, tightly, side by side, shoulder to shoulder, so they're working together on the same tapestry, and we've had to adapt it a bit so that we have maybe, rather than 1 or 2 tapestries in progress, we've got maybe 4 or 5, so that one weaver can work per tapestry and everyone could be a nice big distance apart, and sitting there with their mask on and all of that. But essentially we're able to carry on making, which is fantastic. We do have the gallery, which obviously has had the same problem that a lot of places have, where we had to shut, and where now, even though we can open, we have to limit the numbers, and that is a challenge for us. Like, it's a challenge for everywhere. We want people to keep coming in the door, coming to the cafe, coming in, buying a cup of tea, and keeping the building open for us. So we have been sort of ups and downs with what's been happening with the pandemic, but thankfully the interesting and great thing is that the art world has still continued. There's been a growing interest, I think, in textile art over the past few years, and we've really seen that at Dovecote, people coming into the world of tapestry from other parts of the art world, but they don't know that much about it. It's kind of new to them, and that's been fascinating, and we've been able to get some new and interesting commissions together because of that.
And yes, it's interesting what you're saying. I think it is right to say that people may not know much about tapestry art. So it is very valuable that Dovecote, promotes it. But because I feel like people don't know much about tapestry art, if anybody who's not, familiar or super familiar with it, how would you describe it to someone who doesn't know much about it? For example, where does it originate?
It's, strangely enough, incredibly ancient. I mean, tapestry weaving is probably one of the earliest forms of textile. There's a loom that was probably used for tapestry that was found in ancient Egyptian tombs. So we're talking 3000 BC, that kind of timeline. So we've been making pictures in cloth, which is essentially what tapestry is, if you're going to boil it down to one sentence, for many thousands of years. So that's one side of it. But obviously there is a particular tradition of tapestry that's maybe particularly European, that goes back to medieval times, when it was the highest art form. It was, there were no oil paintings, there were no, even large frescoes. You decorated your palace or castle with massive fabric wall hangings. So that's where tapestry comes from. Obviously, in the 20th century, like a lot of media, it was played around with, deconstructed, put back together as an idea, and that's where I find it so interesting. But its tradition goes back longer than painting. Probably only sculpture probably goes back earlier. So yes, it's a fascinatingly ancient medium, and the techniques we use are not much different to the techniques that would have been used 1,000, 2,000 years ago. It's just the artistic sensibility that's changed. And really, the thing that's very specific about tapestry is the image is woven directly into the cloth as the cloth is made. So it's different to embroidery, where you have a surface and you sew on the imagery you're making. Tapestry, you start at the bottom and you weave as you go up, and you roll the tapestry down onto the bottom beam of the loom, and as you weave up, you build up a picture that is actually intrinsically part of the fabric and structure of the cloth, which is quite hard to explain on the radio, but I think that's the best I can do.
Well, it is a lengthy and laborious process.
It is. It's very, very time consuming. Yeah, it's part of it. It has to be in a weird way, but that's also why it's had its sort of moments in the sun and then moments where it's been less fashionable, I suppose, because art became quite quick and conceptual. And as such, I think it then took away from the interest with the labour that goes into making a tapestry.
It almost counters today's life in a way, but at the same time, for that reason, perhaps provides an antidote to the rapid pace of today's life.
I think there's been a sort of fascinating cultural shift in the past 5-10 years of people being interested in hand making again. Possibly, through Instagram and through these very networked worlds, we're sharing our desire to do things with our hands and to make, which I think is quite interesting.
And of course, Archie Brennan, the man
yes.
We will be talking about, was certainly one of the main exponents to have taken tapestry art into the 20th century and beyond. And the upcoming exhibition that we will be talking about is titled Archie Brennan Tapestry Goes Pop. And these are the dates that I have for it, and correct me if they're wrong. It will be opening next year in March 26, 2021, and will run through June 26. Is that correct?
That is the plan. Yeah, we're ever hopeful we will be able to stick with that plan.
Oh, best of luck. Yes, I absolutely, I hope that by the time the exhibition will run, people will be able to visit it and coronavirus won't be, won't disturb it too much.
We certainly hope we will pass the worst of the winter and that the spring might offer more opportunity, at least for travel within the UK and Ireland.
Before we get into the life and works of Archie Brennan and why he is considered such a major exponent of 20th century tapestry art, I wanted to remind you that there are more Matt's Art Chat podcasts available on such media streaming platforms as YouTube, Spotify, Podbean, and of course, you will also be able to find them on my personal website, inartematt.com. That's INARTEMATT.com. In fact, once there, you'll be able to find more conversations about the arts with creators, curators, and art lovers from all over the world, including one with interior designer Nora Voon.
We always say interior designers are like psychiatrists. You have to understand what your client is asking you to do. Some clients say, okay, I love your style. I want this, right? And you go in with this expectation that your client is okay with you being creatively brave, but then what they want is not what they say they want sometimes. So you really have to really understand the psychology of what they're saying.
To listen to the full interview and more podcast conversations about the arts with creators, curators, and art lovers from all over the world, all you have to do is search Matt's Art Chat on such streaming platforms as YouTube and Spotify, or check out my personal website, inartematt.com. That's INARTEMATT.com. And while you're at it, follow me on Twitter @inartematt to keep up with all the art-related content I produce. Well, some of it anyways. But for now, back to our conversation with art curator Kate GRENYER on tapestry artist Archie Brennan. Who was Archie Brennan?
Archie Brennan was a completely fascinating and brilliant and interesting character and an amazing tapestry weaver. He started at Dovecote as an apprentice in 1947. And he stopped weaving in 2015. So his tapestry weaving life spans many, many decades and many, many eras of art. At Dovecote, he eventually developed and evolved to become our artistic director in 1964. And in the 60s, he was working with a lot of modernist artists to create tapestries alongside them as interpretations of their work, whether their work is painting or similar. So people like Sutherland and Robert Motherwell and others. But during that time, he also developed his own artistic voice in tapestry, and he understood the medium to a incredible degree. He knew it inside out and back to front, and knew the rules by which you were meant to make tapestry, And then I think spent the next 30, 40 years of his career pulling that apart and undermining his own rules and undermining the traditions of the medium and playing with it as a piece of material culture, I suppose, that he can then adapt and react to his own times. I think it's interesting what you said about tapestry being kind of fairly opposite to our very immediate and quick culture, and the fact that Archie understood that even in the 70s and 80s, when pop culture and quick culture was about TV and about tabloid newspapers and about that kind of media, he reacted to that as a source of visual inspiration, and he wove pictures from the telly. He wove brilliant tapestry that's a giant blow up of a tiny throwaway tabloid newspaper article called "Was It Worth It, Mr. Gutenberg?" And he just had this very pithy, very wry sense of humour about everything that he did. And his tapestries, I think, are brilliant pieces of pop and postmodern art. And I think because he was a tapestry weaver, I think his name is not as well known as it might have been if he was working in a different medium. But I think that's one of the pitfalls of working in something as sort of maybe left field as tapestry weaving has become in the 20th century.
By the way, I've also seen photos of him as a young man, incredibly well built, and I read that he was a bodybuilder and former Mr. Scotland.
He was a former Mr. Scotland. He was good friends with the now late, great Sean Connery back in the day when they were both young lads in Edinburgh. And he actually encouraged Sean Connery into life modelling that eventually got him into modelling and then eventually into acting. So Sean Connery has credited Archie Brennan with the start of his career at various times, which I thought is quite a fascinating little sort of tidbit. But he kind of, yes, he loved sport, and he did a lot of tapestries of sporting personalities, and he himself kept very fit. He was a bodybuilder, but he was also a footballer, and all on an amateur level. But there's some amazing photos of him in the 50s, fully built up, and the sort of Mr. Universe photographs and similar. He was a former Mr. Scotland and entered Mr. Universe in sort of 1953. And he was still very proud of those in his old age. He was like, tiny waist there, good muscles,
He lived a life.
So,
He lived a life.
He lived a life. He definitely did.
So what do you think drew him to tapestry art?
It's a strange thing. I mean, Dovecote always took on apprentices from local schools. At that time in the 50s, it was really like learning a trade. Like you'd go and maybe leave school and become a carpenter. You could also, because there was this tapestry studio in the middle of town, go and become a tapestry weaver as a sort of potential business trade. It wasn't necessarily an artistic thing. But there was a change and a shift in the studios in the 1950s. And there was an encouragement that weavers should at least learn simple draftsmanship. So he went to the art college to do evening classes as well, and eventually he learned things like stained glass and other skills. But eventually his love for tapestry just kind of took off, and he just clicked with it as a way of working. And even though he studied other things, he always came back to studying tapestry, and eventually founded the tapestry course at Edinburgh College of Art. So that was quite key to his development, but also key to the development of Edinburgh as quite a centre for tapestry over the next 20, 30, 40 years through till today.
And, you talked about it a little bit in your introduction to Archie Brennan, but I wanted to kind of find out a little more about it. The exhibition, with its title, makes direct reference to the link between Archie Brennan's art and the pop art movement and period. Can you explain that a little bit more, that link and connection a little bit more?
Yeah, so one of the connections is that he was good friends with Edoardo Palozzi, who has a very big influence on those pop movement early years, I think. And also he and Palozzi made tapestry together. All the Palozzi tapestries were woven and designed by Archie, so they were a collaborative process. And so that inspired Archie's own interest in how tapestry, as a fairly ancient medium, he always thought, actually, if you look back at those medieval ones, they're about everyday culture and they're about everyday life. They may be designed for the palaces of kings, but they are about daily stuff and communicating that through a particular medium. And so he was interested in the medium itself and interested in the way cultural images were being shared in his era, the 60s, the 70s, the 80s. And so he did have very many similar interests to those pop artists that we know of. He made, for example, he was obsessed with Muhammad Ali, and he did many, many, many tapestries of the face of Muhammad Ali as found in pop culture magazines, as seen on TV, as seen in, as you know, one of the most famous faces in the world in the 60s and the 70s. And so and he worked in series like that reproduced. He didn't just do the same picture tapestry, that's a sort of reproducing medium, rather like print. So you can make a connection between Brennan's Muhammad Ali tapestries and, say, those prints from Andy Warhol of other pop icons. You know, he really had, in fact, there are Muhammad Ali prints by Warhol, aren't there? So yeah, I think that's one connection. The other one is the way that he sort of deconstructs the medium of tapestry and takes it apart and looks at how it builds imagery and uses the techniques of the tapestry loom to reflect the way that image is reproduced through print, for example. So the way that, if you think of a Liechtenstein design where you've got the newspaper imagery reproduced in paint, but you still see the spots of the printing process, that kind of thing was also reflected in the way Brennan designed and wove his tapestries through the actual technique of weaving. Yes, many. And this tapestry I told you about, the was it Word Fit Mr. Gutenberg? He was looking at a piece of throwaway, like a 2-line quick press article sort of thing that you'd read in a magazine at the hairdressers and then chuck in the bin. And he spent a very long, he played with the fact that tapestry takes a sort of crazily long time to make, given the world of immediate media. Did a large-scale tapestry of this tiny throwaway article. And that act in itself becomes a bit of a cultural and pop culture comment on slow time and quick time and our expectations of things turning around quickly and things being throwaway. So there's so much to what he did that was so clever and so witty, and just very much, he was a tapestry weaver, but he also understood how crazy it was to try and weave tapestry in the 20th century, which was fascinating.
Yes, but nevertheless, there is something really fascinating about the concept of documenting contemporary times with an art form as timeless and somehow unchanged even in its process. I think you mentioned it earlier as tapestry art, right?
Yeah, I mean, he did a lot of really interesting writing about tapestry. And one of the things he kept coming back to is, why am I still making tapestry when it takes so long to do and the world is so fast changing and it seems ludicrous? And yet part of that appeal is how ludicrous it is. And it's still part of the commentary he constantly made about tapestry was how to make it quick, or should it be quick? Should it not just be slow and take time? And the fact that it's slow and takes time means you have to really think about what you're going to do and decide it's worth doing. And the fact that he wasn't so well recognized, I think, is because although he continuously worked, where someone could churn out painting after painting after painting, it would take, 6 months, 9 months to make one work. So it is a kind of crazy medium to be working in, but he understood that and kind of loved the fact that it was, and kind of laughed at it a lot, as part of what he did.
Yeah. So just to return to the exhibition itself, Archie Brennan Tapestry Goes Pop, what's it going to look like? Well,
we're not going to do it chronologically. We are borrowing tapestries from collections, private collections, but also national collections in the UK and private collections all over the world. There are a lot of people in America who are going to kindly give us their tapestries. So we are really collecting a full life's work, but it's going to be themed around those various parts of his life, part of it working with other artists, part of it a very particular interest that we haven't really touched on yet, which is the fact that he wove a lot of images of other textiles in tapestry, which is, if you're perhaps one more for the textile nerds, but it's like myself, but it kind of, it really is a fascinating thing he kept coming back to. So that's a big section of the exhibition. And then his pop art imagery is another, big part of what we'll be showing. So it's going to be the largest retrospective of, the biggest retrospective of Archie's work, as far as we know to date. So really looking forward to seeing it all together in one place, I think.
roughly how many works will be exhibited?
I think last count about 80, but in some cases, some of them are very small.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So I was going to mention I was going to ask you, they're all varied works and also of different sizes, I would presume.
Yes.
Right. So how long are we how big would have been the biggest sort of Archie Brennan work? How large could he go with this tapestry?
I mean, you can go very large. He didn't find that very appealing as such, but there is a piece that is nearly 3 meters by 2.5 meters, I think is the largest that I can think of off the top of my head. That's an Archie design as well as an Archie weaving.
Are there any works from this exhibition that particularly stand out to you personally, and why?
Oh God, I keep go round in circles with that, because every time I see another one, I'm like, oh, that's brilliant, I love that. And then I see another one, I think the same thing. There is a particular series that I'm particularly fascinated by. The idea of working in series in itself is something that's very particular to Archie Brennan. So you wouldn't make the same tapestry you wouldn't make a copy, it's not like an addition. It's just coming back to the same kind of subject matter and then exploring it with a slightly different way of weaving. And this is a series called At a Window. And they began in the early 1970s. And then the last one, I think, was 2012. So he continued to weave this idea of weaving through a window, or weaving images that are associated with windows and looking through a window. And this is his particular reaction against a comment that Le Corbusier made about tapestry, which is that it should be part of a room and part of the overall design of a space, and not be a window onto another world like the traditional tapestries were. And I think Archie was like, yeah, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to tell Le Corbusier where we can go and do these clever, witty tapestries looking out of and into and through windows, because that's exactly what he said was interesting about tapestry. It is an image based. It's not an abstract thing. It doesn't work at its best necessarily as an abstract medium. It is better as a visual, as an image, with recognizable imagery in it, and that's how it works at its best. And that's where he sort of took his stand and put his flag in the ground, I suppose. So yeah, the At a Window series, I think, are very fascinating, particularly if you're interested in art history and those kind of conversations about materiality and illusion.
Right, and it is interesting when you point out that series because it makes me think about the other works that he did where he drew inspiration from television. In a way, windows and televisions are sort of like different types of screens, but both similar in a way.
Yes, and looking onto another world and looking through things through a mediated world, which tapestry is another way of mediating the world, I suppose. So yeah, I think there's so many layers to what he did. It's a lot of it's very witty and funny, but it's all very, very thoughtful, and it's all brilliant imagery and just amazing to engage with. So yeah, we can't wait to be able to see them all together in the same space.
Absolutely. And I remind our listeners that the exhibition is called Archie Brennan Tapestry Goes Pop, and it is set to open at Dovecote Studios in Edinburgh on March 26, 2021. Kate, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. Thanks a lot.
It's been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget that you can listen to more podcast conversations about the arts with creators, curators, and art lovers from all over the world by simply searching Matt's Art Chat on such media streaming platforms as YouTube, Spotify, and Podbean. And you will also be able to find them on my personal website, inartematt.com. That's INARTEMATT.com. We'll hopefully see you next week with another episode of Matt's Art Chat. And if you'd like to get in touch with me, you can contact me via email at inartematt@gmail.com. But for now, stay healthy, stay safe, stay strong, and I wish you well on your artistic ventures.